Something is buried in the bones of New Zealand that rewrites everything we thought we knew about the first people to call it home. And once you hear this, you will never look at their story the same way again. Before we go further, do something small for me. If you have ever felt like the story you were taught about your own people wasn't the full truth, keep that feeling in your chest as you listen, because this story is about to feel very personal. For a long time, most people believed a simple story about the Maori. They were the first people in New Zealand. For a long time, most people believed a simple story about the Maori. They were the first people in New Zealand. They arrived by canoe, settled the land, and lived isolated from the rest of the world for hundreds of years before anyone else showed up. That was the story in textbooks. That was the story in museums. That was the story most of us grew up believing without ever questioning it. It sounds simple. It sounds clean. It sounds like the kind of history that fits neatly into a paragraph. But real history is rarely that neat. Because underneath that simple story, there was another story, a darker one. A story that was taught in schools for generations, repeated by historians, printed in official reports, and used to shape how people saw the land itself. That story said the Maori were not actually the first people in New Zealand. It said there was another group before them, a quieter people, a gentler people, a people who were supposedly wiped out or pushed aside when the Maori arrived. This idea had a name. People called it the pre-Māori myth, or sometimes linked it to a real group called the Moriori, who lived on the remote Chatham Islands, far off the coast of New Zealand. For over 100 years, many people believed the Moriori were an entirely separate older race, a people who had nothing to do with the Maori, a people who came first, lived peacefully, and were later erased. This wasn't just a rumor. It was written into school books. It was taught as fact. It shaped how entire generations understood the past. And it had consequences that went far beyond a history class. Because if you believe a story like that, it changes how you see land ownership. It changes how you see who truly belongs somewhere. It changes who gets blamed and who gets sympathy. It changes how you see who truly belongs somewhere. It changes who gets blamed and who gets sympathy. For a long time, that false story served a purpose for the people telling it. But stories built on shaky ground eventually crack. And when scientists finally began looking closer, using tools that didn't exist 100 years ago, something extraordinary happened. The past started speaking for itself, not through old documents, not through colonial reports, but through something far harder to argue with: ancient DNA. Let's rewind for a moment, back to where this story truly begins, long before ships, long before written history, long before anyone drew a map of the Pacific. Let's rewind for a moment, back to where this story truly begins, long before ships, long before written history, long before anyone drew a map of the Pacific. Thousands of years ago on the island of Taiwan, a group of people began a journey that would eventually stretch across 1/3 of the entire planet. Historians call this the beginning of the Austronesian expansion. Slowly, over many generations, their descendants spread out across the ocean. Island by island, wave by wave, they reached the Philippines, then parts of Southeast Asia, then out into the vast, endless blue of the Pacific. Think about that for a second. No satellites, no compasses like we use today, no modern navigation tools. Think about that for a second. No satellites, no compasses like we use today, no modern navigation tools. Just the stars, the wind, the shape of the waves, and knowledge passed down through voice and memory. These early voyagers eventually reached places like Samoa and Tonga. Then, centuries later, their descendants pushed even further into what we now call East Polynesia, islands like Tahiti, the Cook Islands, the Marquesas. And from there, one of the greatest journeys in human history took place. Around the years 1200 to 1300, a group of these Polynesian voyagers set out across open ocean, further than almost anyone had gone before, and found land that no human had ever lived on: New Zealand. Try to imagine what that moment felt like. After weeks at sea, with nothing but ocean in every direction, land finally appears. After weeks at sea, with nothing but ocean in every direction, land finally appears. Green, massive, untouched. A place bigger than almost every island they had ever known. The people who stepped onto that land became the ancestors of the Maori. This part of the story is not myth. This part is supported by archaeology, by ancient DNA, and by something incredibly powerful, something many old history books ignored: Maori oral tradition. For generations, Maori communities passed down detailed stories called whakapapa. The people who stepped onto that land became the ancestors of the Maori. This part of the story is not myth. This part is supported by archaeology, by ancient DNA, and by something incredibly powerful, something many old history books ignored: Maori oral tradition. For generations, Maori communities passed down detailed stories called whakapapa, tracing their ancestry back through named ancestors, named canoes, and specific journeys across the ocean. For a long time, some historians dismissed these oral traditions as legend. Interesting stories maybe, but not real history. That was a mistake. Because when scientists began comparing ancient DNA from the Pacific with the details in these oral traditions, something remarkable started to line up. The genetic trail matched the story the Maori had been telling all along. Let that sink in for a moment. The very history that was pushed aside as myth turned out to be one of the most accurate records of human migration on Earth. If this is starting to shift something in how you see this story, take a breath here, because we are only getting started, and the next part is where things get even more surprising. Now here's where the story gets complicated, and where the truth starts pulling apart from what people were taught for so long. Remember that pre-Māori myth? The idea that a separate older people existed in New Zealand before the Maori? Remember that pre-Māori myth? The idea that a separate older people existed in New Zealand before the Maori, later displaced by them? For decades, this idea was applied specifically to the Moriori people of the Chatham Islands. The story claimed the Moriori were an ancient, primitive race who lived across mainland New Zealand long before Polynesian voyagers ever arrived. It was taught with confidence. It appeared in official documents. It shaped how many New Zealanders understood their own country's beginnings. But here's the truth researchers have confirmed through genetics, linguistics, archaeology, and careful historical work. The Moriori were not a separate ancient race at all. The Moriori were Polynesian settlers closely related to the Maori, who migrated to the remote Chatham Islands sometime after New Zealand itself was settled. Over time, in isolation, their culture developed differently. Their language shifted. Their traditions evolved in their own direction, shaped by their unique environment far from the mainland. They were not a mysterious lost race from thousands of years earlier. They were relatives, descendants from the same broad Polynesian voyaging story, who simply took their own path. So why did the false version spread so widely and last so long? Descendants from the same broad Polynesian voyaging story who simply took their own path. So why did the false version spread so widely and last so long? This is where history gets uncomfortable, and where we have to talk honestly about how convenient lies can be more powerful than inconvenient truths. In the 1800s, as European colonization intensified in New Zealand, the false Moriori myth became a useful tool. If people believed the Maori had once conquered and displaced an even older, more peaceful people, it created a narrative where Maori claims to the land could be questioned. It suggested a supposed cycle of conquest that colonizers could point to in order to justify their own claims over land. In other words, a false scientific story became a political weapon. It wasn't really about ancient history. It was about who got to claim the present. For over a century, this distorted version shaped land disputes, government reports, and public understanding. It took modern research, careful archaeology, and eventually ancient DNA analysis to finally set the record straight. The truth is far less dramatic than the myth, but far more human. There was no mysterious vanished race. There was no hidden conquest of an ancient people by a later one. There was one incredible story of Polynesian voyaging, branching in different directions, adapting to different environments, but sharing common roots. If you're starting to feel a mix of anger and awe right now, you're not alone. Because uncovering a lie this big naturally stirs both emotions at once, and there is still more layered beneath this. Now, if the story stopped there, it would already be powerful enough. A myth debunked, a false narrative corrected. Oral traditions finally validated by modern science. But ancient DNA had one more secret to reveal. Oral traditions finally validated by modern science. But ancient DNA had one more secret to reveal. And this one reaches beyond New Zealand entirely. For a long time, many people believed Pacific voyagers stayed within their own world, Polynesia connected to Polynesia, island to island, a closed loop of ocean travel that never touched the outside world before European ships arrived. But there has always been one strange clue that didn't fit that picture: the sweet potato. This plant, which originally comes from South America, somehow appears across islands in the Pacific, including areas connected to Polynesian voyaging routes long before Europeans crossed the Pacific. How does a South American plant end up spreading across Pacific islands centuries before European contact? For years, this question sat like an unsolved puzzle. Some suggested ocean currents carried seeds naturally. Others suspected something bigger. Some researchers believe the evidence points toward actual contact between Polynesian voyagers in South America, potentially through incredible long-distance ocean journeys east, followed by a return journey carrying the plant back into the Pacific. This idea remains debated. Historians and scientists continue to study it carefully, and not everyone agrees on exactly how or when this contact happened. But newer studies using ancient DNA from human remains across parts of Polynesia have added something extraordinary to this debate. Traces of ancestry connected to indigenous South American populations, appearing within Polynesian genetic lines, in patterns that suggest contact occurred before European arrival in the Pacific. If this evidence continues to hold up under further research, it means Polynesian voyagers, ancestors connected to the same voyaging tradition that eventually reached New Zealand, may have crossed thousands of miles of open ocean to reach South America, centuries before Christopher Columbus ever set sail. Think about how enormous that possibility is. While much of the world believed the Pacific was an empty, isolated void, Polynesian navigators may have already been crossing it in ways history books never gave them credit for. This is still an area where historians debate details and researchers continue gathering evidence. Not every question has a confirmed answer yet, but even the possibility forces us to rethink something deeply important. The old story painted Pacific voyagers as isolated islanders, cut off from the wider world until European ships arrived. The emerging evidence paints something far more impressive. Skilled, daring long-distance navigators, capable of crossing vast oceans with precision, potentially connecting entire continents that history books kept separate. If this part of the story is giving you chills, pause and imagine actually being in one of those canoes, thousands of miles from any coastline, using nothing but stars and memory, because what these ancestors accomplished deserves to be remembered accurately, not shrunk down into a simple, small story. So let's bring this back to where it truly matters most, the people living today who carry this ancestry. For generations, many Maori communities held onto their oral traditions fiercely, even while outside historians dismissed them as folklore. Names of ancestors, names of canoes. Specific migration stories passed down through careful memory, generation after generation. And now, ancient DNA research is doing something powerful. It's confirming that these traditions were never just stories. They were historical records, carried through voice instead of paper. This matters far beyond academic debate. For a long time, colonial-era historians positioned themselves as the authority on Maori origins. They wrote reports. They created theories. Some of those theories, like the false pre-Māori race myth, caused real harm, shaping unfair narratives used to justify land seizures and unequal treatment. Now, science is circling back to a humbling conclusion. The original storytellers were right all along. There's something deeply emotional about that. Imagine being told for generations that your ancestors' stories were just legend, only for modern science to eventually confirm the accuracy hidden inside them. It's not just about correcting a history book. It's about restoring dignity to an entire tradition of knowledge that was dismissed for far too long. If you know someone who has ever felt like their family's stories were dismissed or overlooked, this might be the moment to send this to them, because sometimes the truth takes generations to catch up to what people already knew in their hearts. Now let's step even further back and look at the bigger picture this reveals. Ancient DNA doesn't just tell us about individual moments in history. It tells us about patterns, movements, choices made by real people, long before written history existed. When scientists studied ancient remains, modern genetic samples across the Pacific, they began mapping out incredibly detailed voyaging routes. Which islands were settled first? Which populations mixed with others? How closely different island groups remained connected across centuries? This data has shown that the settlement of the Pacific wasn't random. It wasn't accidental drifting. It was intentional, strategic, carried out by skilled navigators who understood ocean currents, wind patterns, star positions, and seasonal changes with incredible precision. The idea that early Pacific voyagers simply got lucky, drifting onto islands by chance, has been increasingly challenged by this research. These were not accidental discoveries. These were deliberate journeys, undertaken by people who trusted their knowledge enough to sail into open, endless ocean, with no guarantee of what they would find. And New Zealand was one of the final major landmasses on Earth to be reached by humans. Let that thought settle for a moment. While much of the world had already been inhabited for thousands of years, New Zealand remained untouched by human presence until Polynesian voyagers finally arrived. This means Maori history in New Zealand, while filled with deep tradition and generations of development, represents one of the more recent chapters in the overall story of human migration across the planet. And yet, in that relatively short amount of time, an entire complex society developed. Deep spiritual traditions, structured social systems, sophisticated art, powerful oral history methods capable of preserving accurate information across many generations. This is not a story of a simple or primitive people, as old colonial narratives often implied. This is a story of precision, memory, and incredible human capability. If you're starting to see this story as bigger than you expected, that's exactly the point. Because history often shrinks incredible achievements down into simple sentences, when the real story deserves so much more space to breathe. Now, let's talk about why this discovery matters so much today, beyond old history books and academic papers. Ancient DNA research doesn't just uncover facts about the past. It has power in the present. For Maori communities today, having scientific confirmation of oral traditions is more than an interesting discovery. It's a form of validation that was denied for generations. It also plays a role in something much bigger, ongoing conversations about land rights, historical treaties, and how history has been used and sometimes misused to shape modern policies. When false narratives like the pre-Māori myth were taught as fact for generations, they didn't just distort history, they influenced real decisions that affected real communities for over a century. Correcting that record isn't just about academic accuracy. It's about acknowledging how deeply history can be shaped and misused when those in power control the narrative. Ancient DNA offers something history books alone often cannot, a form of evidence that isn't shaped by political convenience. Bones and genetic material don't have an agenda. They simply carry information. And when that information finally gets studied properly, it can quietly dismantle stories that were once treated as unquestionable truth. This is part of why fields like ancient DNA research have become so important globally, not just for the Maori, but for indigenous communities around the world whose histories were often written by outsiders, shaped by outside assumptions, and only recently being re-examined using more accurate, community-involved methods. If there's one thing this story teaches us, it's this: the people who lived a history often understand it more deeply than those who simply study it from the outside. Science, when done carefully and respectfully, isn't here to override that knowledge. It's here to confirm it, protect it, and finally give it the recognition it deserved all along. If this idea is resonating with you, drop a single word in the comments that captures how this story makes you feel, because sometimes one word says more than a full sentence ever could. As we come to the final part of this story, let's bring everything together. We started with a simple, widely accepted version of history. The Maori arrived in New Zealand, settled the land, and that was the beginning of their story. Then we uncovered something far more complicated, a false narrative that spread for generations, claiming an entirely different ancient people existed before them, a story used not just as history, but as a political tool to reshape land claims and colonial power. Then ancient DNA stepped in, cutting through generations of assumption, confirming that the Moriori were never some mysterious ancient race, but relatives of the Maori, connected through the same incredible voyaging story, simply shaped by isolation on remote islands. Then the story expanded even further, revealing hints, still debated, still researched carefully, that Polynesian voyagers may have reached as far as South America long before European ships ever crossed the Pacific. And finally, we saw something quietly powerful. The oral traditions, carried by Maori communities for centuries, often dismissed by outside historians, were increasingly confirmed by modern genetic science. This isn't just a story about ancient migration, it's a story about how truth can be buried, sometimes by mistake, sometimes on purpose, and how it can resurface generations later, carried not through paperwork, but through bones, DNA, and the patient persistence of oral memory passed down by people who never stopped telling their story, even when no one outside was ready to believe them. It's a reminder that history is not fixed. It's not something locked away in old books, untouchable and final. History can be corrected, it can be challenged, it can be rebuilt piece by piece, especially when new tools allow us to look closer at the evidence left behind. And perhaps the most powerful part of this entire story is this: the people who were once told their history was just legend were right all along. Sometimes the truth doesn't need to be discovered. It simply needs to be listened to. If this story changed the way you see history, or the way you see the Maori people, or even the way you think about your own family's stories, take a moment before you go and think about which parts of your own history might still be waiting for someone to finally listen closely enough to hear the truth inside them.